Okay, next question is, what would you say are the top 5 skills that a comic artist should learn, and how did you go about learning them? Top 5 skills that a comic artist should learn would be drawing skills. I would say that's the first that comes to my mind. I think you need to know how to draw. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're gonna have to know how to draw like Vern Hogarth or Andrew Loomis or something like that. It just means that your drawing has to be convincing. So rather than knowing all the anatomical configurations of a human figure, it's more about understanding gesture and body language and how to convincingly show that someone is happy or sad or powerful or weak, all through just their gesture and their body language. And you can do that with stick figures, or you can do that with hyper-realistic drawings. Either way, the understanding of sort of the framework that lies beneath the structure of the figure is really important. And also, more broadly speaking, even beyond just figure drawing, I think it just helps to be able to draw backgrounds and basic forms of perspective. But knowing how to draw convincingly is really gonna help, because if you have obvious drawing problems, it's just gonna take the reader out of the story. But if your drawing skills are strong, no matter what style you're working in, as long as your style is consistent within itself, you're essentially creating a world for that story to exist in, and then whoever is reading that story isn't even gonna second guess the way you drew the car or the way you drew that building, because to them, it's believable. It feels well thought out, and it just feels structurally sound. So drawing is gonna be really, really helpful for the comic artist. That probably is an obvious one. Storytelling though, you can be the best artist in the world, but you might not be able to take those drawings and tell a story with them. So learning visual storytelling, sequential storytelling is imperative for sure. I very much recommend Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. I know a lot of people are very familiar with that book. It's one of the best, if not the best book on visual storytelling and sort of like the theory behind it. It's not at all a how-to draw book. It's not like how to draw comics the Marvel way or how to draw any kind of comics. It's much more of the theory and the psychology behind how we make sense in our minds when we're putting words and pictures together. How to show the passage of time just with single images. How to utilize all the elements of a comic page, from the panel borders to the word balloons to the space in between the panels. All those elements, every visual element on a comic page is an ingredient in the sauce of the story itself. And every one of those visual elements can be utilized to tell a more convincing story and make it come alive in the mind of the reader. And Scott McCloud in this book does such an excellent job at describing why that is. So in a lot of ways, it's much more of a sort of like a neurology, psychology book than it is a how-to book. But it's really, really helpful in understanding the mechanisms behind creating comic art. Long story short, it's a lot more complicated than you might think. So that's 2. For 3, I'm gonna say, I'll lump these 2 together and I'll say stamina and consistency. I think in order to create a comic, whether it's a 20-page comic or a 200-page graphic novel, there's a certain level of dedication, stamina, consistency that you have to have in order to see the whole project through. It's one of the things that sort of deterred me from wanting to make comics for so long. I grew up loving comics. I was a huge comic book fan, still am. And when I was very young, I wanted to be a professional comic artist. And the older I got and the more I started to study art, and I went to art school and everything, I realized comics are way too hard. They're way too involved. There's too many drawings on one page. I just want to draw one image. And that led me to being more of an illustrator for several years. So before I got back into drawing comics and drawing comics professionally, I kind of ran from it for a long time, just because it's an intimidating thing to have to stick with something that long, to draw a character consistently throughout a whole book. to create a consistent style throughout the whole book, and just to be able to dedicate the amount of time that goes into making a comic. Again, one single issue or a full graphic novel, either one is a certain dedication of your time. It's in many ways, it's a marathon. And just like a marathon, you need to train for it. So I would say the third skill that is really, really necessary for becoming a comic book artist is the capacity to stick with making the comic. So whatever you have to do to build up that stamina and consistency, I definitely recommend doing that. So perhaps I can give you some tips on how to do that in a future video, but right now I would say the third skill that's really necessary for becoming a comic artist is a combination of consistency and stamina. The fourth skill would be, I would say, having some sort of a point of view, like having something to say. It doesn't mean that you have to be like a poet or just like a natural born philosopher or something like that. It just means that you have to have something that sets your particular point of view on how you create art, how you frame an image, how you tell the story and pace the story visually. That has to be uniquely you. And even if you're just a comic artist who is working with another writer, it doesn't necessarily matter. You still need to have something to say. Even if someone else is writing the words, you're contributing to it visually. And you kind of need to have that uniqueness that no one else has. So this is a really hard skill to perfect because it requires a lot of like intangible ingredients. A lot of it might just be the willingness to observe life in a way that might be counterintuitive or a little different than a more conventional, practical way of looking at life on a surface level. Comic art is a very practical kind of art. It's one of the things that I really love about it, but it still is art, and art is ultimately a deeper way of looking at the world, deeper way of looking at life. It's drawing, painting, sculpting the things that you can't really put into words or take a picture of. And even though a lot of us, myself included, aren't, the type of artists like cover our bodies in paint and, dance around on a canvas in front of a group of people or something like that, we're still artists that are bringing our own unique vision of life just by virtue of the fact that we lived a life that's different than anyone else. We're all individuals. My life's different than yours, and so on and so on. So we're all gonna bring something different to the table, even if it's as simple as I grew up in a city, so I like to draw city scenes, and I can draw city scenes in a way that might be more authentic than someone who grew up on a farm, and then vice versa. So it's being able to bring something to the table, your particular point of view, your accumulated experiences throughout life, bringing that to the table. Doesn't mean that every comic that you work on has to be an autobiography. I hope it's not. Those are some of my least favorite comics. But like an actor might bring a little piece of their personal life into the role of, say, I don't know, Edward Scissorhands or Quasimodo or whatever. It just helps bring that character or bring that story to life in a different way that another artist couldn't. Okay, so that's 4. A fifth one I'm gonna say would be something like learning how to write. Even though that might sound counterintuitive for someone who is trying to be a comic book artist, I would say learning some basic forms of writing. I am by no means a good writer, but I found that the more I gave a little bit more attention to the art of writing, understand writing and story structure a little bit better from a writer's perspective, that has kind of helped me become a better visual storyteller. And I would give this advice to comic writers as well, is to learn the basics of drawing, laying a page out, whatever it might be. You don't have to become a professional comic artist in order to write well and vice versa. But understanding how to tell a story through just words, I can't tell you why or how, but it has made me a better visual artist. I guess it's sort of like an adjacent creative path, writer, illustrator, and the more we can kind of understand each other's process, the better we become at creating this thing that we're ultimately trying to create, which is a convincing story, just through different means. At the very least, it just makes you appreciate your particular discipline, because after a certain amount of time of learning about writing and trying your hand at writing, you might just be really, really thankful that you are an artist instead. So at the very least, it just allows you to be appreciative of what you're good at. But yeah, fifth skill, learn how to write if you want to draw better.